because as a junior television producer, I went to Number 10 with the senior presenter from ITN, where I was working at the time, on the lunchtime news programme, and we'd secured an interview with the Prime Minister at the time, who was Margaret Thatcher. And after the interview, she showed us round the floor that we were on where we'd done the interview. She talked about all the Prime Ministers. I don't know if any of you have been to Downing Street, but there are portraits of all the Prime Ministers all the way up the stairs. She knew every single one. Her history was extraordinary. She showed us tables and cupboards of gifts that had been given to her and to the UK, but they were all on display there. We're not allowed to keep any of these if they belong to the state. She was charming, actually. Made us all feel incredibly welcome. And the relevance of this is that I was standing there as quite a young producer at the time, thinking, how on earth did I get here? And what am I doing? And really wondering, you know, having to pinch myself, what was I doing there? So, I'll explain this shortly. I was a bit of a rebel at school. Not in the sense of being really, really naughty, but just because I didn't really want to end up going to university and studying what everybody thought that I should study, which was French, because French was my best subject. And I was taken in to see the headmistress, and when I walked into her study, my parents were there. I had no idea they were going to be there. And they tried to persuade me to do French, to study French, because I had said I wanted to do sociology. It was quite a new subject at the time. It was sort of had slightly hippie connotations. And, but I was really interested in learning about social history, about people, about what made people tick. And I didn't want to do French. I knew I would continue with my love of French, and I have. And I work in French as well now. So I kicked back and it didn't go down well. So one of my headmistress's sayings was, take life by both handles. And every prize day, every year, she used this phrase, grasp every opportunity. And she also gave me a great sense of equality. We were an all-girls school, but she made us believe that we could do anything and we were equal in the world, that we could be equal to men and we should be treated in exactly the same way. And this was a fantastic background for me, and it kept me going quite a lot of the time in my adult life. And so I went to university, I did my sociology, and after university I took a bit of a break and I went to South Africa. And it planted the seeds of my love for South Africa and then Africa itself. I was fascinated. I loved the scenery, I loved the mountains, the open space. And I've been to South Africa many, many times since. It's one of my favourite places. After that, I decided that I wanted to be a journalist. Journalism was in my family. My father was a journalist. We were a very news-orientated household. We talked a lot about politics. And so I decided that I would write to the main newspapers, and I would write to the BBC, and I would write to ITN. None of the newspapers replied, and the BBC replied and said that as I could type, but I couldn't do shorthand, I could join the typing pool. So this wasn't really what I wanted. But ITN said, come talk to us. So I did. And I worked initially as a PA secretary to somebody who was very involved in the management of the company. He later said to me that he had wanted somebody who did shorthand, and the only reason he gave me the job was because I had a degree, and he rather liked the idea of having a PA with a degree. So I wasn't terribly impressed by that, as you can imagine. By then I'd got to know where I wanted to move, and I wanted to work in the newsroom. I wanted to be in the thick of it, and I wanted to be on the news desk. That was my dream at that time, to be a news editor. And he was very reluctant for me to move. He didn't encourage me. He was quite against it, and I was obviously not terribly happy about that either. So I moved to work for the editor, Sir David Nicholas, and that was fine. He was quite happy for me to go and work for the editor. And Sir David Nicholas had a completely different attitude. He encouraged me, he developed me, he sent me on training courses. He was absolutely behind me moving to the newsroom. And I'm eternally grateful for that. And I still keep in touch with him, and he's now in his 80s. And in fact, I am seeing him next week, so I'll tell him about today. So we had some great moments. You probably all know who this is. We secured an exclusive interview with Richard Nixon when he was still president. And it was quite a coup, because ITN was quite small in those days, and the BBC obviously was a much bigger organisation than were our great rivals at the time. So he came to London, and it was agreed that he would do the interview in the editor's office. And we had the office cleaned, we had the furniture cleaned, all ready for this visit. And the day before the interview was due to take place, 6 CIA men came into the building to check out the office, and they arrived in my office, all with their typical white trench coats on, talking down their cuffs and ears and all the rest of it. Walked into the office, and that was it, and the door was closed. And a few minutes later, David came to the door and just beckoned me like this and put his hand over his lips. Come in, come in. I walked into the office, closed the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes. These 6 CIA men, security men, were jumping up and down all round the room on the furniture, on the couch, on the chairs. And they were checking the chairs and the couch for explosives and listening devices, as if that's what they did. So they were like this round the room. It was quite extraordinary. We couldn't really believe it was happening. The whole thing seemed absolutely ridiculous. As we know, he fell from grace spectacularly, and his style of leadership was really about deceit and lying and trying desperately to cling on to power. So that was not a good example of leadership. So I eventually got into the newsroom. I became a news editor. I moved to Channel 4 News, which was produced by ITN and in the same building, and I had a terrific time. And I then decided that I wanted to work in radio, because I'd only worked in television up to that point, and I was interested also in working in radio, so I worked in radio for a while. And then we as a family moved to Northern Ireland. My husband's from Northern Ireland, and we went to live there. As you can imagine, it was very difficult and a volatile situation to work in. We were there during the Troubles, and it was quite a tricky place to be. And I joined the BBC at that point, and I learned a lot about listening skills, negotiating, working in delicate and sensitive situations, talking to people who were acutely impacted by what was going on. And I learned a lot about tricky situations. I came back to London and I got a job at the BBC in London, again as a news editor. This was another story that was huge, obviously, and reverberated around the world. And the death of Princess Diana had a profound effect on everybody in the newsroom, of course. But it particularly affected me because I was the mother by then of 2 children, and they were similar ages to Diana's children. And it was quite hard holding the balance between the professional and the personal, and remembering that I was a professional journalist and I needed to keep telling the story. That's what I was there to do. But it was really hard, and that balance. And when I reflect now on this time, it reminds me that that is another situation with leaders, that they have to keep that balance and remember what is head stuff for the organisation when sometimes they're inclined to heart stuff. and keeping that balance. And sometimes it's very difficult, but for the organisation, they sometimes have to do more of the head stuff than the heart stuff. There were a lot of politics in the news. There were also a lot of politics at the BBC, there still are. And during that time, I moved into management. I managed a very large team of journalists, but I also started coaching and mentoring young journalists particularly. I enjoyed working with them. I enjoyed seeing them flourish and developing. And I became much more interested in that than all the other stuff that I was getting involved with in writing reports. And I think that this is something that does happen when people move away from what we call the coalface. That what really grabbed me about being a journalist was the fact that I was in there and in the middle of it. But when you move away from it into a management role, you become disconnected. And I know from talking to people that they often find that this is quite an issue for them. I became more and more interested in the coaching, and I felt that this was the most enjoyable part of my job, and I began to think about maybe this was something that I might do away from journalism, and that was kind of where it sat in my head at that time, that I loved doing it. So sometimes life throws you a curved ball, and I got mine. I suddenly became seriously ill, and it gave me a lot of time for reflection. And a girlfriend sent me a card with this on it, and I really like it, and I think it speaks to a lot of women about how actually when things are down, we cope. And I kept that with me, and I still have the card. So it was a time for reflection, and I decided to leave the BBC, and I decided to try and build a business in coaching, and I went back to university and I did a master's in coaching and mentoring practice. And it was quite scary. I was letting go of a safe environment, a good salary, predictable. I knew what I was going to be doing every day. But I think maybe going back to my slightly rebel streak, I wanted to try something different. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, or try and do it. And it went back again in my head about my old headmistress telling us all to take life by both handles. So I set up my business, but I also set myself some other challenges. And I went on a trek to Peru. I decided I was going to go and do something. I wanted to give back, so this was for the British Heart Foundation, and it was really hard, really, really hard. It took us 4.5 days of trekking, and as we got higher, obviously altitude, it did affect me. I felt quite rough with it, to be honest. And the scenery was again absolutely beautiful, and again lots and lots of mountain scenery, which I just really, really liked. And we walked during the day very, very slowly, and then at night we camped in the very, very basic campsites. Very, very cold at night, and there were very poor facilities, I have to say. In fact, really no facilities. It was pretty awful. But we coped, and the scenery kept us going. And it taught me about pushing beyond those safe boundaries sometimes, because you don't know what you can do and what you're capable of until you try it. And the exhilaration of doing this really was quite transformative for me, and it was a fantastic experience. I went to Africa again. I went this time to Kenya. The Brain and Spine Foundation was the charity on this occasion. And we had a marvellous time walking Masai Mara and the Rift Valley, and again this wonderful open landscape, which was terribly appealing. And we went to a village, and we'd taken footballs and papers and books and pens for the children in this school. And they were laughing, and they were lovely, and they sang to us. And then out of nowhere appeared all these women in this wonderful ceremonial dresses. and sang to us and danced for us as a measure of respect and appreciation for what we'd done. And I thought this was incredible. I thought they were quite awesome because they didn't know us, they didn't have to do it, but it was a very generous thing that they did and really quite touching. So I carried on working, and I work in Dubai now. I've been working in Hong Kong, Scandinavia and Europe, and I had the privilege of going to work in Ghana and doing some coaching with some fantastic people, and I had a dream for Central that, you know, I hadn't got any experience with Central and West Africa at all, and I was really struck by in the most difficult circumstances. I had no idea. I was really quite innocent, and it made me think that some of the experiences of the clients that I work with in Europe, really, their challenges don't compare. And one particular client that I worked with in Ghana, a woman, was supporting her family and her greater family, helping work away, and she told me about having to pay for a borehole in her yard around her house to get water because the water supply was so intermittent. She paid for a generator at her house because she was fed up with the supply being cut off and she didn't want her children to be affected by this. She was an incredible woman. She had been the first person in her family to be educated. She worked hard. She had children she supported. And she was also very interested in her own development. And I just felt that she was such an example to me as a woman about what you can cope with, and again about what you manage when you really have to. So, back to leadership. My continuing learning about leadership is that there are rough times, there are rough seas, and everybody gets these, but I do think that actually they can sometimes be rougher for women. It's also worth bearing in mind that we all face obstacles, and some of those obstacles for women are different for men, I'm sure, except for the men in this room. A lot of cultures have a very male-dominated society. They're very resentful of women coming up and being senior and concerned about having women bosses and so on, as has already been mentioned. There's also quite a challenge for women about where their career goes when they go on maternity leave and have children. And in some organisations, and I know we have lawyers here and former lawyers, but it often comes up in law firms here, that they are sort of written off because they go away and have children. And actually many of them want to come back and carry on with their careers, but they're sidelined. And a lot of women leave their organisations because they don't feel valued. And nobody asks the question, well, why are they going? And they're a great loss in that regard. There's a lot of self-doubt, there's the challenge of juggling family, but there are some fantastic role models as well, and particularly in Africa. You know these people better than I do, or of them. Joyce Banda, the late Wangari Maathai, sorry if my pronunciation isn't right, and the wonderful top accolade of the Nobel Peace Prize to 3 people, you know, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Layman Bouri, and Tawakkol Karman, who lives in the Yemen, and my recollection is that she wasn't allowed to go and get her prize in Norway, which is a great shame. So, you do get still waters. You have to find them sometimes. And it's terribly important to find those still waters. We talked about time management earlier and about thinking time. And I'm currently studying for a diploma in the neuroscience of leadership, which is absolutely fascinating. And it's really around the brain and what happens in the brain. And there's a lot more research about the importance of the brain. And we do a lot of the kind of thinking and working, the tasky stuff at this part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and it gets completely overloaded. And when you get into a more stressful situation, it just can't cope, and that's when you react badly, that's when you lose it, basically. And you need to give that part of the brain a rest. It's only a small part of the brain, but it takes an awful lot of energy. And it's really important to have thinking time, and one of the things that I do in my coaching is working with the thinking environment, just letting people think. And I find that often people just need time to talk things out, and to have a listener who's objective in a confidential, safe space. And we know that mindfulness is terribly important, and we look at the whole person. It's not just their work environment, and they can't think straight if they don't have that time. I found this statistic incredibly shocking. I had no idea in the UK that there would be 1 million more women entrepreneurs if they were setting up business at the same rate. So we need to know why this is happening, because this is not right, and think of the input that they can give to a country's economy and to feed forward to other women coming behind. So, and this is 2013, this is research, and I think it's shocking. And we need to do more to help these women. So, what have I learned so far about leadership? Well, it's hard. Okay, it's hard. And I think some people feel that they want to give up sometimes, but I would say keep going with it. You have to practice. You have to practice the skills. Sam Ryder has written in the program about emotional intelligence, and you have to practice these skills. You have to put yourself in other people's shoes who work for you. Think about things from their perspective. Communicate with them, but keep practicing, and don't be afraid to practice imperfectly, because unless you practice, unless you're prepared, you won't get to where you want to get. Use all your experiences. We've heard this morning already. Use all your experiences to learn wherever they are, whoever you're talking to. You never know what might come up in terms of opportunity. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Look for sponsors, look for mentors. Don't be afraid to ask. I had tremendous support from mentors. I was very lucky. I've had tremendous support from my husband too. But it's important to ask, because if you ask, you will receive. There's no doubt. Expand your networks. Again, we've heard this morning. Talk to people. Look up. Expand horizons. I was talking to a client who was originally from Senegal, and I was telling him about today. And I said, what would you say if you were at that conference? What would you say? And he said, I think this is a fantastic organisation. I think it's wonderful that this is happening. And I would say, don't forget to look up, look beyond. Remember, as we already heard, we're global now. It is a village. It's very easy to go everywhere. So look beyond the connections. When you're comfortable, there is more, and you can learn more by communicating, connecting externally. I would say push into the universe and be open to what comes your way. You just never know. And sometimes it's luck, but I also think sometimes you have to create your luck. I'm setting up a new business with a colleague, and even at my great age, and we're working in a very completely different environment around leadership, that actually leadership is, all the old style of leadership needs to change. We're in a different environment now. It's much more volatile, and we need to work with that. And it's much more diverse, and we need to embrace the diversity. And we are developing a 360 questionnaire, which also covers unconscious bias, because now this is something that's coming to the fore, that there are unconscious biases which we all have, but we need to learn where they're coming from, and we need to manage them. And so those biases are against diversity, against sometimes culture, against people who might be disabled, young people, older people. There are these biases which need to be uncovered and embraced in new leadership, a new style of leading. I want to leave you with this quote, and I am going to read it. I don't like reading off PowerPoint, but I do think it's important, this one. The women of today are the thoughts of their mothers and grandmothers, embodied and made alive. They are active, capable, determined, and bound to win. They have 1,000 generations back of them. Millions of women, dead and gone, are speaking through us today. This was written in 1889, over 100 years ago, by an American woman called Matilda Joslin, who set up her own newspaper and edited it. And I say to you and to all of us, let's keep this going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. That was a wealth of information in there.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I took away a lot from what she said. I was very interested about her thoughts on leadership. You know, the fact that you need to be mindful, that you need to change up your leadership style to lead in rough times and to lead, you know, during the quiet times. You know, and